Hello everyone, here's a new educational chess game. I have the white pieces and I'm going to start with the pawn to e4. I'm playing against an Indian player rated 1831. There we go, he plays g6. By the way, this g6 move is typical of the king's Indian defense. Alright, I'll play d4. He plays bishop to g7, pawn to c4. He plays d6, I develop my knights. And now he plays e5. Here I'm going to take a bit of time because this is the first time there's structural contact. I need to know which pawn structure I want to go for, what kind of pawn structure I want to play in the middle game. If I capture, he can recapture with the bishop and he'll end up with a very nice diagonal. So of course I can push, or I can defend the d4 pawn with knight to f3. He might want to play bishop to g4, pin the knight to increase the pressure on the d4 pawn, even though I can play bishop to e3. But then he'll still try to play knight to c6 to attack the d4 pawn. So here I'm hesitating between knight to f3. Bishop to e3 is also possible, or the d5 push. I'm going to play the d5 push. It might not be the best move, but I'm opting for a close center where the play will naturally shift to the flanks. He plays knight to f6. I play bishop to f2. He castles kingside, knight to f3. I'm also preparing to castle kingside, and now that the center is blocked, he'll look for pawn breaks. He has two types of pawn breaks. This push to c6 to make contact with the d5 pawn is his first pawn break. And the other pawn break is to move the knight in order to play f5. I also have two pawn breaks. Trying to play c5, but that's more complicated here because I'm under pressure on d5. Or the f4 pawn break, but I need to move the knight. Plus, the f5 pawn is a pawn that protects the king. Captures would allow him to free his bishop, open the file, and free the square. So pushing f4 isn't ideal either. Generally, white tries to play c5. But since he just played c6, for now I keep defending d5 and I castle kingside. If he takes on d5, I want to recapture with the c-pawn. I absolutely want to keep the e-pawn to block the e5 pawn and hinder the activation of his bishop. If I had recaptured with the knight, I would have lost the pawn on e4. So I prefer to recapture with the c4 pawn on d5. He plays knight to d7. If I pin with bishop to g5, I'll have to deal with h6. If I retreat, I'll definitely have to deal with g5. So I might want to play bishop to e3. But knight to g4 will come to attack this bishop. We can play h3 to be able to play bishop to e3. But I'm even thinking about moving my knight. That way I could play f3 without worrying about knight to g4 because the bishop could take the knight. And especially the knight on f3, if you look closely, it doesn't really have a job. Attacking the e5 pawn, I'm never going to try to take it. Going to d4 isn't possible. Going to g5 or h4, for what purpose? So I'm looking to move this knight, but I need to figure out where. You can play knight to e1 to bring it back to d3 and fight against the black knight establishing itself on c5. You might want to play knight to d2 to then go to c4 and attack d6 with ideas like knight to b5. The problem with knight to d2 is that I block my bishop. I would need to be able to play knight to c4 before placing my bishop here. Why not actually? Alright, I'll play knight to d2. But if he plays knight to c5, he'll have this double attack on the e4 pawn. And if I play f3 to protect it, I'll have to watch out for checks on b6 because I don't have my bishop there yet. There, he just played knight to c5, so I'm considering b4 to push his knight back. When you chase a knight with a pawn, you always have to check if the knight can penetrate your position, especially by coming to d3, but fortunately the bishop is watching over that square. So I play b4. So why am I trying to attack d6? Because d6 is the backward pawn in his position. It's a pawn that can't advance, that's behind his pawn structure, and that can't be protected by another pawn. So it's a target I can try to attack with moves like knight to c4 and knight to b5. Even if the queen defends, he can still bring his knight back to d8 to defend. There, he just played knight to d7, and now I'm looking at knight to c4. He can't chase my knight away with b5 because then there would be knight takes b5, although he could then take on e4. But after knight to c4, if he plays b5, it's not the b5 pawn I'm going to take, it's the d6 pawn. So I play knight to c4. And I'm shifting the battle to the queenside, because after all, it's on the left side of the board where I have the space advantage. And he plays knight to b6. I'm considering bishop to e3. If knight takes, I can recapture. But then he'll go for queen to c7 to attack both the bishop and the knight. So I could defend with queen to d3. If I take on b6, queen takes, bishop to e3, queen takes on b4, that's unpleasant. And if I don't exchange and play knight to a5? After all, where would his knight on b6 go? And with knight to a5, I put pressure on b7 and prevent his bishop from developing as he'd like. And after that, I'll play bishop to e3. It's a shame because I was happy to keep that pressure on d6. But I'm going to play knight to a5. If he plays queen to c7, he attacks the knight on c3. I can defend with my bishop, but I'd really like to put my bishop on e3. So maybe I'll have to defend with my queen before, of course, placing a rook on the c-file opposite his queen. On queen to c7, I can also play knight to b5. That attacks his queen, so he won't have time to take on e4. He plays a6, probably to prevent the knight from coming to b5. I'm going to play bishop to e3, putting initial pressure on his knight to tie his queen to defending the knight. But he can also play moves like knight to d7, which also frees up his f1 pawn for the f5 push. No, he puts this knight on d7 maybe to chase my knight away with b6, but then I'll get the very good c6 square. I can simply play rook to c1. I'm going to put the rook on the file. That can't be a bad move. Although sometimes we're surprised by moves we think are correct, but which actually turn out to be mistakes. So you have to be careful with all these choices. So here he's in trouble. You see the b7 pawn is under pressure. If he plays b6, I get the c6 square. He can't bring his queen out to b6, my bishop is there. On c7, the queen would be facing my rook. So he's going to look for a way to develop, but the bishop can't move. Normally he has to move his knight, for example, to e8 to get the f5 lever, find a way to develop on the king side. Knowing that I can never really take on f5, because he'll recapture and the e5 pawn will no longer be blocked by e4. So the pawn will advance and that will free his bishop. That means if the knight moves to e8 and he plays f5, I'll have to reinforce with f3. And at that point he can play f4 to push back my bishop. Then g5, the center is blocked. So he can push the f and g pawns. I have no access to his king. Then h5 and look for g4. He'll bring his knight back to f6. He plays knight to b8. Here he's looking to play b6, because if knight to c6, he'll take. That's not so bad for me because I can recapture. I get a passed pawn, I open the file on the backward pawn, and I get this square. This square is interesting because if I play bishop to g5, I could eliminate his knight to get into d5. So I can let him play b6 to get the c6 square. I'm also considering knight to a4. He controls b6. If he plays knight to e4, knight to b6, I attack his rook, which moves to a7. And then my knight can take his bishop with my bishop attacking his rook. So knight to f4 isn't bad. In my opinion, he's going to play knight to d7 to defend the b6 square and free up the f-pawn. After which I could possibly play knight to c4 to have double control of the square. But I have to be careful about the fork. Look, knight to a4, knight d7, knight c4, the fork with b5. My knight goes to b6, attacking the rook. It's still interesting. I'll play knight to d4. I have little time left. Fortunately, a 3-second increment, 8-minute game plus 3 seconds per move. So here, I let him take on e4 to get into b6. I play the weak square on b6, that is, this hole on the queen side. He plays bishop to d7, attacking my knight, but then knight to b6. I attack his rook, which goes to a7. I take his bishop, and after that I catch his rook. And you can see how my knights managed to take over the squares, the f5 square, the b6 square, black squares by the way, which the bishop on g7 doesn't defend. His pawn structure is troublesome for him because he has pawns on white squares here, so the dark squared bishop has to watch out for infiltrations. He has pawns on the white squares here, so the dark squared bishop isn't there to watch for infiltrations. And he has the pawn on e5 and the pawn on d6, which are on black squares but block his bishop. So he played knight takes e4. So I take his rook. My bishop can also come to b6. He plays f5. He's looking to play f4. All right, I take the pawn on b7, attacking his queen. He plays queen to h4. I still have to be careful not to get checkmated. Okay, I play knight to b6, attacking his bishop. If I play f4, I think I'll take his in-between bishop. No, he plays bishop to b5. All right, I take his bishop and I'll play f3 to chase his knight away. And try to take on d6. f3 also gives my bishop a retreat square on f2. His queen doesn't have many squares. If the knight isn't there, I can look for queen to d2, bishop to g5. She still has some squares. She's not completely trapped. She has the h5 square. 26 seconds. I have to play quickly though. There we go. He comes to f6. I take on d6. He plays f4, bishop to f2. We push his queen back, and the knight has the e4 square. He plays queen to g5. I can play knight to e4, but he might take. I'll play rook to e1. The idea with knight to e4 is that if he takes, I recapture with the rook. I didn't want to recapture with the pawn. You never know. It could allow moves like f3 later. You see, my rook was there, so after knight e4, knight takes, pawn takes, f3 comes under the support of the rook. So my queen can't take my pawn either, and that threatens mates. Knight to a4, I attack his queen and his knight. My knight on b6 also protects the d5 pawn. You mustn't give him any counterplay. You have to lock in the bishop on g7 behind the pawn. On e5, I take on f6 and I'm going to put my rook on e4. Maybe queen to c2. I'll offer him a queen exchange. That way my queen is on the file and can move to the e4 square. 12 seconds, but is my time not increasing or what? I'm playing too slowly. And on top of that, there's a fly coming on my left. I'm under an air attack, trying to distract me. I'm going to play rook to c8 to relieve myself, offer a rook exchange. These are moves you can play quickly, that's the point. My queen defends b4, the knight can't take. And I have the d-pawn that's going to try to advance. Also, when the d-pawn advances, it gives me possible checks. I can get back at his king. There we go. Now he has less than a minute too. He's going for the e6 square, but I'm going to pin him. King to f7. I'll play rook to c1 to threaten rook to c7. The knight is pinned, it won't take my rook. I could also have pushed my passed pawn. He comes to control the square. I'm going to play bishop to b6. If bishop takes, knight takes, and rook to c7 becomes possible again. Plus, he has good control over the dark square, which will prevent my pawn from promoting. So I need to exchange some pieces. He plays e4, I take his queen. Of course, he's going to take back. Most likely with the bishop, because if he takes back with the knight, he loses, and here he resigns, because if he takes back with the knight, I capture his bishop, and if he takes back with the bishop, I can still win this pawn. I have a considerable advantage with an extra rook. I need to be careful because he might try f3 to free the bishop and attack my rook, but I just need to move my rook and there's no danger. I support the passed pawn, an extra rook, more pawns. It's easy to win. So the computer gives me 96% accuracy versus 89% for my opponent, and the critical position is right here. You can see here that I have a considerable space advantage on the queen side. I've immobilized his pieces. The bishop can't move because of the pressure on b7. I have the bishop controlling the a7 square. The bishop and the knight are about to come into b6, and my opponent played bishop to d7. So I went into b6 attacking his rook. He played knight to e4. I win his rook. But if he moved the rook, I would have traded by taking the bishop. And in any case, his rook was hanging. So what else could he have done? He could have played knight to d7 to try to defend the square. But then I would have played knight to c4. I was talking about this move to have both knights plus the bishop on the square. And I was calculating the fork on b5. But I would have gone into b6. So I think with this knight actually to free up the rook. And you see, when you go into b6, you attack the rook. But even if there's an exchange, we recapture and attack the rook. But what's interesting is that when the rook moves, there's also this attack on the bishop on c8. The queen is the only one defending. Well, there's the rook too, but it's behind. And also when the rook moves and we take the bishop on c8, afterwards we attack the rook on a7. So the position here collapses because he's really lacking space. And I can pile up pieces. I already have both knights, both bishops, the rook on the file aiming toward the queenside. But I can still bring in the queen, double the rooks on the file. There's too much pressure and too many weak squares. I hope the game was interesting, instructive, and entertaining. You can leave me likes, comments, share the video, and of course support the channel. Goodbye everyone.